This brief shares insights from a study of Air Force tribal culture. The unintended consequences of the practice of tournaments are highlighted to promote discussion and questions about the methods we use to develop workforce capability. The importance of understanding how cultures develop has recently been drawn to our attention by two important events. One is the release of the Air Force strategy that identifies the need for cultural change to address emerging global conditions and threats. Two is the release of the Afghanistan inquiry, identifying the potential dangers in allowing tribalism and elitism to go unchecked and unexamined. This quote I saw at the Canberra Museum on the weekend I thought was particularly pertinent to this issue. My research on Air Force tribalism coincided with Dr. Cromfort's 2016 study of Special Forces. The lessons revealed by CDF in the ensuing Afghanistan inquiry by Brereton identify a number of similar challenges across defence. While many might argue that the devastating effects highlighted by CDF are extreme, it does provide a warning of the depths to which tribalism can impact on an organisation's morale, reputation, and ultimately its effectiveness. Hypercompetitiveness and tribalism have been identified in a range of scandals and tragedies that have occurred over time throughout defence. Examples such as ADFA, HMAS success, and the Afghanistan inquiry force us to face our defensive routines that hide the truth about our culture. While we espouse fairness and inclusion, our lived experience points to a hyper-competitive and elitist culture that empowers some over others. First, I want to be clear about the term elitism. The word elite is defined as a select group who are superior in terms of abilities or qualities. Elitism is the belief that a society or system should be led by an elite that dominates. It is the superior attitude or behaviour associated with elitism that is most damaging. The hypercompetitiveness of elitism has been shown to be universally destructive. A 1920 study on the social order of chickens that coined the popular phrase pecking order led to an experiment where super chickens of high productivity were compared to the rest. The super chicken high performers were separated from the rest. The study showed after 6 generations, the average group were fat, fully feathered, and egg production had slightly improved. The super chickens, however, all but 3 were dead. They had pecked the rest to death. It turned out that high productivity of the best had only been achieved by suppressing the productivity of the rest. Similar to the super chickens, the highly tribal society of Spartans was also built on a pecking order. Spartans' elitist and hypercompetitive warrior culture produced a militarily supreme but intrinsically self-destructive society. The Spartan warriors selected their best from birth, setting them on a separate path of sudden death challenges to the top. Any failure meant permanent exclusion from the tribal elite. The Perekoi who supported the elites were kept in line with rare opportunities to join the elites if proven worthy. True Spartans, however, were the only tribal members able to transcend to the highest elder and chief positions. The helots, rest, that made up the vast majority of Spartan society, were kept in their place through the constant threat of humiliation and annual ritual killings. While the numerous high-stakes challenges shared by the elites did create a close-knit tribe of superior and self-disciplined warriors, a system based on attrition cannot and did not survive. A similar tournament system of attrition, the Empire Air Training Scheme, was used by Air Force with great success during World War II. With little time but large numbers of volunteers, Air Force could afford to send potential pilots on a series of challenges, efficiently cutting away failures to leave only the best. Based on the success of the program, the tradition of tournaments for pilot selection and training continues. And although we no longer acknowledge it in doctrine, the effects of the tournament continue to impact Air Force. Air Force strategy acknowledges the need to develop our culture differently. Response remains a vital component of defence, but current global conditions demand that beyond excellence in high-end warfighting, we also need to win without fighting. We equally need to shape strategic areas of interest and deter would-be adversaries from grey zone tactics. It has been acknowledged that we are moving from wars of attrition to wars of cognition. The following findings in my study identify some of the challenges we face in transforming our culture to one that aligns to future demands of a skilled and intelligent workforce with a more inclusive culture. The findings recognise not only that elitist tribalism is still a part of Air Force culture, but also identifies positive and negative effects that tribalism has caused. Beyond that, though, I wanted to know how elitist tribal groups were formed and what we might be able to do to effect change. Starting with the observations provided by senior leaders about their experience throughout the years, interesting insights were revealed about how our system develops different tribal behaviour. From this starting point, I used Shine's concept of 3 layers of culture: the tangible artefacts, espoused values, and underlying assumptions, to help understand what the varied cultures looked like and how subcultures were developed. The first task was to identify the different types of tribes. 3 distinct tribes with their own traditions, rituals, and ways of behaving emerged. Alphas represented the fighter pilot, aircrew, or operator tribe. Bravos represented the engineer-type rest, and in this case, it was HR-related roles. And X factors represented executive tribal culture within the organisation. An important distinguisher between Air Force tribes was the tangible sense of empowerment. A short note about the scope of the study is that it was limited to officers to minimise the differences in implicit and explicit power that separates enlisted from commissioned officers, and the amount of analysis of interview material required for ethnographic approaches. Following up with in-depth interviews of trusted tribal insiders revealed varied motivators and values that further distinguished differences in tribal culture. Alphas spoke of trust, teamwork, training, technical mastery, and elitism. Bravos spoke of invisibility and lack of pride in their tribe, lack of opportunity and challenges, and minimal sense of inclusion or team cohesion, or any sense of valued purpose. X factors, having primarily come from alphas, understood how entitlement and elitism was part of their tribal identity, and that they had been subjected to both the positive and negative effects, such as the need to conform and behave according to tribal norms. They also demonstrated an understanding and empathy for other tribes within the organisation, and appeared to be more open and encouraging to the idea of empowerment and innovative and critical thinking. After comparing the differences between what we could see and what was said, it was time to understand how tribal cultures had formed. Using Shine's 3D concept of an organisation, the study of patterns of movement across organisational boundaries revealed some intriguing results. Here, the 3 major directions of movement are shown. Radial movement inwards indicates greater inclusion and influence. Circumferential movement around indicates crossing of different functions. Vertical movement upwards indicates hierarchical progression in rank. Researchers argue that culture is influenced towards either conformity of expected norms or rebelling to varied degrees dependent on socialisation tactics used at each of those organisational boundaries. It's important to understand that people are most susceptible in the outer limits of temporary tribal member status. This is where individuals must prove themselves worthy of belonging to the tribe. Crossing inwards through inclusion boundaries increases an individual's influence as they increasingly understand the implicit and secret criteria for inclusion and accepted norms of tribal behaviour. Studying the patterns of movement for each tribe revealed the following. Alphas had minimal to nil movement across functions. Their entire focus was in achieving inward influence and empowerment based on the perpetual thread of tournament tactics using the criteria of technical mastery. Once insider status was achieved, a slipstream of hierarchical progression through the ranks usually followed. Bravos, on the other hand, had extensive movement across functions and minimal to nil movements toward insider influence or empowerment. With almost no challenges of their technical, social or organisational mastery, little sense of pride or tribal bonding occurred. This tended to lead to limited hierarchical progression through ranks, orbiting the outer circles of the organisation with almost non-existent opportunities for command or influence. X-Factors were very aware of the continuing tournament slipstream and remained mindful of movement across functions into organisational Siberias that indicated the potential end of their vertical progression. Alphas entered X-Factor tribe membership with increased levels of inclusion or inner circle status. The few Bravos who gained X-Factor tribal membership, on the other hand, were very aware one chance to prove themselves worthy of inclusion was given. Interestingly, this was the time that empowered influencers were given the opportunity to momentarily step out of the inner circle and explore. This heroic cycle proved to be where many X-Factors exploited their innovative and critical thinking potential. Research shows bootcamp-like socialisation tactics, i.e. alpha, produce conformity, while more individualised tactics used on Bravos and X-Factors should tend towards more innovative behaviour. What was surprising was that innovative socialisation tactics had minimal effect. Alphas were empowered but conformed due to the need to belong that overwhelmed any intrinsic motivation for creative or innovative behaviour. Research says Bravos should be more innovative, but a lack of empowerment and inclusion created a sense of defeat and inhibited the sharing of good ideas and therefore the exploitation of innovation. X-Factors had the most potential for critical strategic thinking and innovation, but the continued threat to their need to belong to empowered tribes impacted on innovation. When provided the opportunity to temporarily step away from the tournament, X-Factors tended to behave in innovative ways. What was clear was that tournaments excessively threatened empowerment and ultimately impacted on intrinsic motivation for mastery and creativity. Probing further into behaviours, 3 major conclusions centred on motivations driving tribal members. Number 1 was the motivation for inclusion and belonging, which proved to be the prime motivating factor influencing tribal behaviour. According to Baumeister and Tice, a major cause of anxiety is caused by exclusion from social groups. Fear of being excluded is deeply rooted and innate. The criteria for inclusion is, according to research, based on alignment to values, competency and attractiveness. In this case, the criteria for inclusion was heavily based on competency or technical mastery for alphas. He has good hands and feet is a common term used to describe flying skill within the tribe. As the most empowered tribe, this criteria of technical mastery determined the pecking order of the tribes. Bravo inclusion criteria tended to embrace the grey, with each member having varying beliefs about their technical mastery. X-Factor inclusion criteria was the recognition of social and combat mastery. More importantly, due to the short tenures of postings, focus on achieving outcomes and a get-it-done attitude was a critical inclusion factor. So the second most powerful observation was that empowerment was incredibly important. Despite any of the socialisation tactics used to develop innovative thinking, innovation tends not to occur unless there is empowerment. Good ideas need communication flow. They need to be shared and explored in order to be exploited and transformed into an innovation. Empowered tribes tended to dominate and control the flow of information, and therefore what innovations were valued. Without empowerment, good ideas rarely go anywhere. Empowerment was and is everything. Empowerment has a spiralling effect as there is greater tolerance of those empowered. Research shows empowered tribes are given greater tolerance of behaviour and were more likely to act in risk-seeking fashion. With those less empowered, they face a double bond of not only less tolerance and greater chance of punishment for speaking out, but also less chance initially of being seen, heard or taken seriously. With few success role models and many examples of punishment, the less empowered tend to conform and adopt obsequious and self-defeating behaviour. The third and final conclusion or observation was that excessive extrinsic motivation also tended to negatively impact on intrinsic motivation. By using technical mastery as a criteria for inclusion, an innate passion for flying and achieving mastery in the air was dampened by a need to conform to certain ways of behaving and thinking in order to belong. The justification for keeping high-stakes tournament tactics was that standards would drop, but that was hard to identify when you could see with the passion of pilots and how much they absolutely loved flying. Intrinsic motivation for bravos revolved around their passion for learning, but had been skewed into mastery of following procedures and policies. Intrinsic motivation for senior leaders mostly centred on the noble intent of defending their country and an understanding of strategic level thinking. Knowing deeply held intrinsic motivators are already present, it begs the question why so much emphasis of tournaments continue. So what can we do with this information? What appetite is there for change, and how pragmatic are those levers for change within the organisation? Air Force strategy has identified the need for change and directs our transition through 5 lines of effort. 3 of those are especially relevant to this study, lines of effort 2, 4 and 5. So 2 directs people to challenge the status quo, think innovatively and nurture influential relationships that hone intellectual edge. Line of effort 4 identifies the need to systemically reward strategic thinkers irrespective of background. Recognising the need for cultural change, Air Force strategy identifies rewarding critical and strategic thinking, removing silos and the prioritisation of specific specialisations, opening up career progression pathways, and examining cultures of exclusion and how that impacts on bringing people in and keeping them. Line of effort 5 identifies that we must also review how the workforce is designed and managed by offering an enhanced career management system capable of identifying and nurturing talent, regularly reviewing the way Air Force workforce is designed, organised and managed, and recommending reorganisation activity that spans across command chains. It's easy to see the intent for change, but it's difficult to tell if there's any incentive to remove those elements that might be impeding our progress and achievement of those strategic goals. This study asks the question whether tournaments still meet Air Force needs. While tournaments have built an elite tribe of highly specialised and professional warriors, do past benefits outweigh future costs? Tournaments create a skewed organisation that favours some tribes over others. While Air Force has recognised the need for a more balanced organisation and has implemented strategies to correct those imbalances, will cultural resistance impede its success? Cultural change experts warn of resistance to change, but researchers have shown it's not resistance to change, but resistance to loss that is the issue. Who has the most to lose and what will be lost? Some have argued that loss of standards is the issue, but is that really the case? We can look externally to the Swedish Air Force as one example of success using open contest versus tournaments. Proposed solutions to the SAS example may also be worth examining. Internally, a practical way forward is to look for hurt points. Where do tournaments begin? Where are they at their worst? Identifying unacceptably high failure rates is a starting point. Finally, looking for areas of future potential exclusion as we transition to new platforms and capabilities is worth contemplating. What possible tournament-like conditions might arise from cyber, space, and special or limited access programs, and those that may have limited transparency and the ability to control the flow of information? Thank you for listening. I hope I've raised some questions for you, and I'm happy to discuss at any time.